Nush, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for organizing this. It's so wonderful. I am delighted to be here today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nicholas Seager, reader in English literature and head of the School of Humanities at Keele University. It's been my privilege to get to know Nick because of his stellar work on Daniel Defoe and his unflagging support of the International Defoe Society. Indeed, Nick's Defoe bona fides are intimidating. He holds the Fredson Bowers Fellowship from the Bibliographical Society to conduct research on Moll Flanders. He's also keeping himself busy by editing Defoe's letters for Cambridge, co-editing an edition of Roxana for Oxford, and co-editing the Oxford Handbook of Daniel Defoe. In other words, both meticulous and expert, Nick is such a thorough master of Defoe that he's one of the very few handful of people I believe if he tells me that Defoe did or did not actually write something. But Nick's interests are wide-ranging and far-reaching, so you may know him from other contexts. He co-edits the 18th century essays portion of Literature Compass. He's the editor of the excellent Broadview Press edition of Samuel Johnson's Life of Savage, and he's co-editor of the award-winning essay collection, The Afterlives of 18th Century Fiction. Nick is also the author of the 2012 The Rise of the Novel, A Reader's Guide to Essential Criticism. I have a personal history with that book that I'm going to share because being an American, I was forced to return to teaching quite shortly after I gave birth to my daughter. And this volume saved my life. My own brain was barely functioning, so I needed Nick's brain and his lucid prose and thorough, balanced, but rigorous and pithy account of perhaps the most impossible to digest area in 18th century studies. It allowed me to stumble through that semester with any degree of dignity intact at all. So in short, I highly recommend The Rise of the Novel, A Reader's Guide to Essential Criticism. You may notice, as I read off Nick's thoroughly intimidating list of publications, how often he's come up as an editor and a collaborator with other scholars. And I wanted to underscore one of Nick's most important strengths there, which is his participation in scholarly community. Literary work today still defaults, at least in the administrative imagination, right, to the pose of the solitary scholar in the Tower Library, when the reality is that almost none of our best work can be done without an extensive network of support from others who care. And yet, as we try now to normalize collaboration, we still have to grapple with the fact that our work is so often stronger when we build partnership into its infrastructure, but we have that nagging worry, will this count to the people that are counting? Collaborative work is rewarding, it's more than worthwhile, but to undertake it is also a bit brave. I have a contribution in the Handbook of Daniel Defoe, and so I can state from firsthand knowledge that Nick is a thoughtful, generous, responsive editor, one whose input strengthens the scholarship of those lucky enough to work with him. And I think it's important to say, too, that when I asked to bring in a younger scholar as a collaborator, he backed me up and he made that happen. So for all of these reasons, I am so pleased and so honored to be a part of today's seminar in which Dr. Seager will be speaking to us about the celebrated Daniel Defoe, the reception and publication history of Defoe's nonfiction.
Thank you very much, Nush. I'm trying to share my screen, but I'm told that the host has disabled participant screen sharing, so that might be a Rebecca job. Say when. There we are.
That's great.
Excellent. Yeah, well, thank you so much, both to Rebecca for organising ODSECS and also to Nush for that really, really generous introduction. It's a great privilege to be here. Thanks a lot. I've been working on Defoe bibliography in a quite
Nick, there's a little bit of problem. There's a little bit of problem with your
quite a long time in it. And then, can you hear me?
A little bit of a problem with your sound. It's glitching a little. It's glitching a little bit.
How is it now? Is it any better?
Yeah, that's. Let's have another go. You might want to just start from the top.
Okay, I might lean in a bit. So yeah, I've been working on Defoe bibliography for a bit of time now, in a quite sort of not systematic way. And I think I've got quite a lot of information about how Defoe was republished down the years, but not really much of a sense of what it all means. So that's what I'm looking for feedback from everyone today, and I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes in total. I'm not going to talk about Defoe's fiction, although I'll start with them. In 1722, Defoe published 3 major novels which have been extensively republished since then, including abridgements, serializations, excerpts, translations, and appearances in collected works. By 1900, Colonel Jack had appeared at least 31 times, A Journal of the Plague Year at least 47, and Moll Flanders at least 61. Some of the dates here are conjectural, and these are at least figures because there could be some duplicates. These are pretty impressive numbers, but they fall short of a less celebrated production of the same year. Religious Courtship, a series of imagined dialogues that offers devotional dating tips, inveighs against interfaith marriages, and guides people on how to indoctrinate their servants, was published at least 63 times by 1867. And whereas the novels were often popular in radically abridged or bowdlerized versions, most editions of this 350-page conduct book were complete and accurate. Religious Courtship's frequent publication for the first 150 years of its existence indicates the endurance of this brand of didactic literature well into the Victorian period, just as the flatline beginning in 1867 shows the converse. Apologies for presenting line graphs at the current moment. But it also indicates that the circulation of Defoe's works down to 1900 is not just the story of Robinson Crusoe, fantastically popular as that novel was. Nor is it just the story of Defoe's fiction. Defoe's political works in prose and verse, his histories, commercial essays, travel books, and religious writings were repeatedly republished in Britain, Ireland, and America before the 20th century. This publication history is largely unknown and is overlooked in current accounts of Defoe's posthumous reputation. Bibliographical work on Defoe has understandably focused on attribution. Fairbank and Owens' critical bibliography sought to establish the basis of his authorship for individual works, adding just brief mentions of later 18th century editions. For Defoe, we have nothing resembling the Tearing Scouten bibliography of Jonathan Swift, which goes down to 1814, or the Fleeman McClavity bibliography of Samuel Johnson, which goes up to 1984. Some work on the publication histories of the novels, particularly Crusoe and Roxana, have shown how unstable Defoe's texts are due to the prevalence of abridgment and rewriting in the case of Crusoe and the proliferation of continuations in the case of Roxana. Defoe's publication history is therefore sometimes best considered in terms of adaptation and appropriation in response to shifting tastes. And no less than the novels, Defoe's non-fiction works circulated in versions he would hardly have recognised, as they were commonly abridged, expanded, or rewritten, mostly by unidentified agents. Current accounts of Defoe's posthumous reputation exaggerate the degree to which he was disregarded or denigrated before revival in the 20th century. John Riccati reflects this perspective when he says that Defoe seems to have been little read or remembered in the years after his death. Ashley Marshall, meanwhile, suggests that the view of Defoe as a literary author that followed mid-20th century accounts of the rise of the novel completely overturned a 200-year treatment of him as a slapdash journalistic hack. My talk is not aiming to ignore the frequently sneering assessments of Defoe or the enduring criticisms of his political activities and writings, but it does aim to rebalance understanding of Defoe's reception beyond the fiction. In the talk, I'm going to focus mainly on Defoe's writings on politics, history, and trade. The major omission, what you won't hear about, are Defoe's religious writings, conduct books like the Family Instructor Trilogy and Religious Courtship, and treatises on occult topics like the Political History of the Devil. My rationale is partly just the necessity of selectivity that your patience and my time allowance requires, but also because these religious books were published in dozens of editions, tending not to name the author, at least until well into the 19th century, and even then in ways that don't always inspire confidence. Just as anonymous publication was common in Defoe's lifetime, it persisted in his posthumous publication history. Few editions of either Moll Flanders or Religious Courtship on the chart I had earlier identified their author. These editions of Religious Courtship, the Family Instructor, and the History of the Devil are fascinating in their own ways. Many are illustrated, many are marketed at poorer readers, and some of the devil ones adapted to contemporary satire. But today I want to think primarily about the construction of Defoe as a thinker on politics, history, and trade, which is the mainstream of how his non-fiction was read in the first 2 centuries. So first off, politics. You'll probably know that many of Defoe's works are topical pieces, not by and large republished to any extent after their original moment, but some exceptions to immediate obsolescence show that Defoe's ideas on financial and political subjects were repeatedly applied to later debates. An essay upon public credit, for instance, was reprinted several times in the 18th century, but usually attributed to Robert Harley, the politician whose fiscal management it promoted, as with this 1797 edition. The essay's treatment of financial crisis evidently resonated during Pitt the Younger's controversial suspension of the gold standard early in 1797, following a run on banks after reports of an abortive French invasion at Fishguard. As the title page specifies, the Marquis of Lansdowne recommended the essay in a House of Lords debate after the Bank of England began to refuse specie payments. It was then reprinted with annotations as, quote, a work of the utmost importance in the present awful situation of public affairs. So an essay upon public credit was reprinted irrespective of the fact that Defoe wrote it, which was still unknown, but editions of his other political works advertised their topical relevance with reference to him. The original power of the collective body of the people of England is a good example. Responding to the House of Commons imprisonment of 5 men from Kent who presented it with a petition in 1701, Defoe's tract argues that political sovereignty derives from and may revert to the people, freeholders at least. In Defoe's lifetime, extracts from the original power were reprinted by his enemies in attempts to embarrass Defoe when he was criticising groups who questioned Parliament. But later in the century, it was republished when the question of the native liberty of the English subject was keenly debated. The 1769 edition, published by Richard Baldwin, included a prefatory letter from a liveryman to his peers defending petitions protesting the House of Commons expulsion of John Wilkes. By annulling the Middlesex elections at which an obstinate electorate repeatedly returned Wilkes, the author insists, representatives have betrayed voters' trusts. This excellent tract, it goes on, by the celebrated Daniel Defoe is an undeniable and irrefragable answer to the friends of arbitrary power. There's an undated 3rd edition of the Baldwin original power, which has a different prefatory letter addressed not to the ordinary man, but to London's elected dignitaries. Catalogues assign this edition to 1770 with a question mark, assuming that it's a later printing of the 1769 one, but I'm fairly confident it's actually earlier, a response to the 1763 excise crisis, the badge of slavery alluded to towards the start of the preface. It also capitalises on Defoe's growing reputation as a tireless friend to liberty. The reprinting, the author says, of this excellent piece of the celebrated Daniel Defoe, who understood as well as any man the civil constitution of the kingdom, seemed to be altogether seasonable and fitting. Yet another edition of the original power from about the same time, published by J. Williams, the one on the right, in 1771, signals its topicality on the title page. It's addressed to the King, Lords and Commons, necessary to be read at this alarming crisis. This frankly could refer to any one of the populace's grievances in the wake of the instalment of the North Ministry. The original power was also invoked and partially reprinted in newspapers in the 1770s and 1790s as part of the responses to the American and French revolutions. One commentator in 1785, George Chalmers, opined that it was better political philosophy than Locke's 2 treatises, which history has not borne out that judgment, but it's fascinating to think that Defoe was put in that company 50 years or so after his death. Few of Defoe's poems were republished after 1731, and the ones that were tended to be on political topics. There are a few exceptions. The first posthumous edition of the True-Born Englishman, 1700, was the 23rd edition in 1733. there were at least 28 further editions from 1740 to 1795, a rate of about one every 2 years. Major poems by Dryden and Pope get nowhere near these numbers. The poem's satire on notions of English racial purity ensured its continued relevance. It had particular resonance in the case of the first American edition, Philadelphia 1778, probably during British occupation of the city. It was perhaps enjoyed by the colonists as a satire on the enemy because, like several 18th century editions, this one omitted the preface, making Defoe's satire seem more straightforwardly anti-English. With such a regular rate of republication, the True-Born Englishman was the exception among Defoe's poems. Even a Defoe admirer like William Hone judged Defoe's Jure Divino unfit for republication entire, a judgment borne up the next couple of centuries, due to its dated historical reference and its lacklustre verse. But Hone's The Right Divine of Kings to Govern Wrong, 1821, its title from the Dunciad, selects from and rearranges Jure Divino, turning Defoe's satire on divine right theory against the revival of what the radical Hone calls priestcraft and kingcraft after Peterloo and the accession of George IV. This is pretty innocuous, but one of my favourites. A 1748 reprinting of Defoe's Caledonia, his other poem on national identity, I guess, is a rare example of a work Defoe published in his own name, made anonymous in a later edition. Here, Defoe's authorship is effaced and the poem is shamelessly presented as original. The text is altered, descriptions of the Scottish nobility are updated, stanzas referring in the 1706 original to the prospective Act of Union are deleted, and this version is dedicated not to Queen Anne, of course, but to the Duke of Argyll, formerly the Earl of Ely, a man, incidentally, whom Defoe detested. To give a small illustration of the textual changes, Defoe's account of Scottish military triumphs is augmented by several new lines on their late great feat at Berg ob Zoom in the War of the Austrian Succession, lines which surely surpassed Defoe's worst poetic faults by rhyming performed and redound. Caledonia apparently offered some welcome boosterism in the wake of the 45, as well as a route to patronage for one patriotic plagiarist. The examples that I've given so far, focusing mainly on politics, have showcased some of the grubbier sides of Georgian print culture, anonymity, cheap populism, and plagiarism. But there's more to how Defoe's non-fiction appeared, which we see by looking at his histories. Defoe's major historical work was the History of the Union of Great Britain. Its vastness precluded its republication for a long time, but it became freshly topical in the late 18th century. In 1786, John Stockdale issued a lavish new edition, which was also reissued the following year. Stockdale's advertising campaign emphasised the history's heft, one large volume quarto containing 1,000 pages, and touts bonus features, an elegant engraving of the author, you can judge for yourself, a copious index compiled by the British Museum's cataloguer, Samuel Ayscough, issued separately as a prospectus, a long introduction by the constitutional theorist Jean-Louis Delhomme, also separately issued, and a life of the celebrated author by the Scottish antiquarian George Chalmers, which claimed that the history would have ensured Defoe's immortality, even had he not written Robinson Crusoe. The whole thing cost a whopping £1.10, or 111 6 on royal paper. This prestige edition appeared, as that advert kind of hints towards, in the wake of the Constitution of 1782, which freed Ireland from British rule and raised the prospect of an Anglo-Irish union. The title page of the Ayscough index drew attention to the ripeness of the occasion for a new edition of Defoe's history, as the Irish Union was subject of debate in both countries. Delhomme's essay in the edition introduces Defoe's work by reflecting on recent developments, and he echoes Defoe in emphasising the long-term benefits of the 1707 Anglo-Scottish Union. Significantly, though, Defoe is not wheeled out as elementary propaganda in favour of an Irish Union. It is credited for a complex consideration of the challenges presented by political unions. Delome infers from Defoe that in such treaties it is not a consolidation of interest that is meant to be effected, but an equalization of them. Not that the interest of both parties should be to every extent the same, but that where interests are distinct, independent, and often incompatible, they may be so modified by mutual concessions that neither party shall derive any advantage from such arrangement, which shall not be compensated to the other. An incorporate union of Great Britain and Ireland may be pronounced the most desirable object of both kingdoms, yet it is certainly not without its difficulties. So there's not yet this sense that Defoe's history of the Union is a kind of whitewash, a sort of simple Whiggish English account. This, of course, ignores disparities in power in all kinds of ways, but it shows the respect in which Defoe was held. After the 1798 uprising of the French-backed United Irishmen, Defoe's Whiggish account of how unity emerged from hostility in Scotland in 1707, ending centuries of conflict and keeping out the French, seemed more relevant than ever. In 1799, there were two selections from his history published by John Exshaw in Dublin, both aiming basically to promote the Anglo-Irish Union. One, on the left, comprises just 66 pages of extracts and uses Defoe's work to insist that union will guard against populist revolution. It equates the 1707 Jacobites with the 1790s Jacobins. Exshaw's other abridgment, 200 or so pages on the right-hand side, calls Defoe's book the best and most copious source of information on its subject, but says that it's too expensive and is padded with original documents. The abridger says that his first intention was to prune Defoe's prose, but the clear and impressive style of Defoe put paid to that idea. In their separate ways, the Stockdale, London, and Exshaw edition in Dublin show that Defoe's abilities as a historian and a constitutional thinker were clearly highly rated. Much less famous than the history of the Union, Defoe's Memoirs of the Church of Scotland did not fade into oblivion either. It was republished in 1734, like the 1717 original, anonymously, and retitled An Ecclesiastical History of Scotland. This was another topical intervention. Defoe's account of the Presbyterian Church's steadfastness during persecution was reissued immediately after the first secession of ministers in 1733, who cited doctrinal laxity as their reason for leaving the church. A century later, now assigned to Defoe, Memoirs merited 3 editions in the 1840s. The Reverend William Wilson, as the title page shows, provided scholarly notes and an admiring preface outlining Defoe's qualities as a historian. Defoe, he says, is no cold-hearted chronicler. He does not seek to disguise his passionate admiration of the Church of Scotland. Like those who resurrected the original power, Wilson, bearing in mind his own perspective, granted, represents Defoe as a fighter against tyranny, motivated to defend the Church of Scotland by what Wilson terms his enlarged love of liberty. He laments that the Memoirs has been neglected due to Defoe's double offence of being pro-Union and English. These Scottish published early Victorian editions of the Memoirs were again occasioned by schism in the Church of Scotland that is. The so-called disruption of 1843 resulted in the formation of the breakaway Free Church of Scotland, whose adherents objected to the state's encroachments on the spiritual independence of the Kirk. Wilson was part of that breakaway, and he conscripts Defoe's anti-Erastian memoirs to the cause. The mainstream church, Wilson laments, has entirely destroyed the foundations of Defoe's eulogy. She is no longer a free church, and she is no longer a Presbyterian church. So Defoe's memoirs is doing a kind of polemical and nostalgic piece of cultural work here. It all shows that Defoe clearly remained in the cultural memory long after his death as an enduringly relevant commentator on politics and history. He was invoked in new editions to address issues of the day, not just in hastily produced interventions, but in lasting editions which praise, discuss, and apply his ideas. The idea that Defoe was perceived as a slapdash journalist who struck gold with a few adventure stories is basically untenable. In the last section, I want to turn to Defoe's writings on trade. The regular new editions of Defoe's monumental tour through the whole island of Great Britain during the 18th century are not responses to particular political events like some of my previous examples, but they do signal the tour's enduring relevance to a nation undergoing seismic socio-economic changes. Two early serializations under different titles brought the originally voluminous and expensive tour to a wider readership by spreading the cost of purchase. There was a lavish 540-page quarto, Curious and Diverting Journeys in 1734, and an unacknowledged recycling entitled The British Traveller as the first column or so of a farthing newspaper in the early 1740s. In terms of official editions, there were 9 of the tour throughout the 18th century, and these moved quite early from the original octavo to the more portable duodecimo format. That's not all that changes. Across these editions, the tour was incrementally altered and augmented to reflect regional developments. The editions show a desire not just to churn the thing out, but to curate, refresh, and update it for later generations. Each new edition came with very great additions, improvements, and corrections, which bring it down to the year 1738, 1742, 48, and so on. It was expanded to the extent that it went from 3 to 4 volumes in the 1742 third edition, and from 9 shillings, 12 in price. The 1742 preface states that many very material omissions required these editions. The tourist overlooked cherished antiquities and passed wholly by several of the best towns, it says. 1742 added more than any other edition, both entire new sections and piecemeal changes. Its 4th volume, covering Scotland and considerably expanded from what Defoe wrote, was separately published in 1746, catering to curiosity about that country after the 45. The 1769 7th edition first announced Defoe's authorship and Samuel Richardson's early role in expanding it. The attribution is repeated in subsequent editions, though very little more is made of it. The publishers wanted to present the tour as an up-to-date national survey, attachable in some way to famous dead writers, but not merely a historical artifact. Today, I really can't offer a full account of the successive textual revisions to the tour, but I can indicate something of the overall effect by tracing the evolution of the tour's account of Leicester. In 8 paragraphs in the original, Defoe's work focused on the major industry, weaving, and on agriculture, the prodigiously proportioned livestock that underpinned that industry, with a few nods to civic, geographic, and historical matters. This screen indicates new paragraphs, additions to the 2nd edition in 1738, and my slides that follow will signal those additions using bold and blue text and deletions across through. So you can see that in 1738, we get some updates on the location of the burial of the 14th century Duke of Lancaster, a matter that, it must be said, didn't terribly much excite Defoe's curiosity. Each new edition works from its predecessor. So 1742, the most significantly expanded edition, made the account of Leicester double the number of paragraphs than the original, placing as much emphasis on ancient, medieval and modern history, Romans, Richard III and royalists, as on present-day commerce. In case you're curious, it was wrong about Richard III's burial place. So that's 1742. The next edition to add substantially to Leicester was the 1761-62 6th edition, starting with a couple of new builds, Stanton Harold and the Hastings. There's a nice remark in the original tour back in 1724, where Defoe says that new mansions are springing up even as the sheets of his book are coming off the press, making it immediately out of date. And these later editions kind of respond to and testify to that aspect of building in the 18th century. The edition concerning the legend of Judge Sparr was promptly removed in the 1778 8th edition, showing something of an impatience with myths. 1778 added more details about new country houses and archaeological finds. The overall point of this kind of process of adding to the tour is that Defoe's focus on current commerce textile trade underpinned by sheep farming was over time interlarded with lots of information about ancient and modern history, archaeological discoveries, and descriptions of country houses. By 1778, a more leisurely pace tour had evolved, which perhaps made the whole thing more serviceable as a guidebook as domestic tourism boomed, and it reflects growing pride in the national heritage, but it's also a more diluted analysis of commercial systems than the book Defoe wrote. A letter to the Gentleman's Magazine in 1783 called the latest edition the strangest jumble and unconnected hodgepodge that ever was put together. To look at some of the editions of the novels. It's testament to Defoe's tour, anyway, that it remained serviceable in the main for the rest of the century, and it's a sign of his standing that this reader at least, of Defoe's standing, that this reader at least preferred the unadulterated original. Last example. A similar process of editing and updating happens with the Complete English Tradesman. That work was published in a string of editions by the Rivingtons, effectively as a paired set with Defoe's Plan of the English Commerce as having been written by the late ingenious Mr. Daniel Defoe. The title page of the 1738 fourth edition of the Complete English Tradesman, left, advertises very great alterations and improvements. It transformed the book, as the preface explains, from 2 large volumes in octavo to 2 smaller and more portable volumes in duodecimo, around 750 pages total, reducing the cost from 11 to 6 shillings. The 1738 edition reproduces Defoe's preface, but then extends it to account for the extensive changes. The crotchets or square brackets throughout the edition, as here in the top left corner of page 10, are used to signal the added content. The book is attributed in this extension to the preface for the first time 7 years after his death to that ingenious gentleman, the celebrated Mr. Daniel Defoe, whose extensive knowledge in all the branches of the British trade and commerce is sufficiently known. The editor maintains this respectful tone, yet points out shortcomings that justify the additions, deletions, and rearrangements. Defoe, he says, can be too verbose and circumlocutory. However, stylistic and structural faults are imputed as much to Defoe's circumstances as to his incompetence. Defoe was paid by the sheep, so his books are padded out. Tradesman was written in 3 disjointed instalments, whereas he, in 1738, can see the plan of the whole. He says, we had the whole before us at once and were better enabled to put it into method. He reorders the chapters, he adds topics that Defoe didn't tackle, and he adds information about newer legislation concerning insurance and things like that. So like the tour, the point is that the Complete English Tradesman was seen as a living document, not something to be allowed to slide into obscurity, but something deserving refreshment. The overall effect of the changes is to make the book a far more practical manual for the aspiring merchant, stripping out some of Defoe's more exploratory episodes, anecdotes, and reflective passages on the clashes between capitalist and Christian ethics. Defoe's insights into the tortuous morality of early capitalism, for which we, accustomed to read the novels in that vein, I guess, so value the Complete English Tradesman now, were subordinate to a narrower educational function. What's more, a 1745 fifth edition of the Complete English Tradesman, which is based on the 1738, removes these additional paragraphs in the 1738 preface, where Defoe's authorship is acknowledged and where the changes are justified. It also removes the crotchets with which the 1738 signalled additions to Defoe's text. Hence, those edits become silent and the book is restored to anonymity. In this form, authorless and adulterated, the 1738 text endured in several new 18th century editions and was even used in the multi-volume works of Daniel Defoe in 1840, the first of many Victorian collected editions of Defoe, including his fiction and non-fiction. It's another reminder that the Georgians and Victorians often read Defoe in altered states. Okay, so to come to a close, I think that there's some truth in John Ricchetti's remark, which I quoted earlier, that Defoe seems to have been little read or remembered in the years after his death. Later 18th century readers were certainly not seeking out books by Daniel Defoe in anything like large numbers. However, Defoe was extensively republished beyond the fiction, albeit often anonymously or in modified form, for readers of various social levels. So Defoe was being read far more than we've allowed, and when he is remembered in these editions' paratexts, it's with reverence, as a powerful polemicist, a skilled prose stylist, an insightful historian, an authority on commerce, and a defender of political liberty. We can do away, I think, with the idea that Defoe faded into oblivion before the 1780s, and do away with the idea that he was regarded merely as a political hack before the belated critical acclaim accorded to his novels in the last century. Above all, commentators found Defoe wonderfully adaptable to their own purposes in the present, ranging from those 1760s Whiggish conceptions of liberty to 1820s radicalism, from debating Irish union to defending the established ecclesiology in Victorian Scotland, from understanding British commerce as a system to providing quite practical instruction to budding tradesmen. Thank you for indulging my exploration of this material, and I'm very keen to hear what you think about it all.
Nick, thank you very much. I feel like we should give you a round of applause. So if you stop sharing your screen, you'll be able to see us all, giving you a round of applause, and you can do that either by just raising your hand, or you can use the Zoom reactions button if you want to give claps like that. So thank you very, very much indeed. That was a really fascinating talk and gives us a really new perspective on Defoe and what he might have meant through the 18th century and into the 19th. While people are gathering their thoughts and thinking about questions they might want to ask, I know from a conversation that we had earlier that you're rereading Journal of the Plague Year at the moment, and I was thinking about active rereading in the modern day, and whether your experience of rereading that text that's quite well known to many of us in plague time has made you think in any way differently about these acts of rereading through the 18th and 19th centuries.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Rebecca's alluding to a little reading group that I think maybe, I don't know if anybody else apart from maybe Ben Pauly is part of that's here, but yeah, we started off by reading a Journal of the Plague Year. Now we're on to Charles Brockton Brown and Philadelphian Yellow Fever, so that's something else. But I tried to dissuade the group from going on to Defoe's due preparations for the plague, the non-fictional work on the plague, because it's less exciting. But actually, I was rereading that recently, and it's probably way more interesting in terms of lockdown mentality than the Journal of the Plague Year. That's no kind of answer to your question, but yeah, you know, I read Defoe too much, the problem, including the boring stuff.
No, not at all, not at all. That's wonderful. Thank you. Are there questions? If you have a question, then if you could get the chat up. So if you're not familiar with Zoom and you look down the bottom of your screen, probably you'll see a whole pile of different icons, and you can see chat. It's a little speech bubble. If you have a question, could you just pop the word question into the chat, and then I will be able to call on you, and I will ask you to either to type the question into the chat or to unmute yourself and to ask the question directly. So Stephen Gregg, I know you've got a question. Would you like to either unmute yourself or type the question?
Okay, thanks Nick for a fantastic paper, and it's really great to see this reevaluation of his non-fictional works. I've got just a really almost boring question, but it's kind of going back to that the data you presented in your first slide. And I wanted to ask about the bump, a significant bump around about 1791, where it seems his non-fictional works got a number of his non-fictional works seem to get a little kind of extra bump there. I wonder if you could say something to that.
Have a look. This one. 1791. Have a look. Okay. So the problem is that the picture of all the people is kind of in the way of the chart for me. I think I can just remember how it goes. I think a couple of things. One is that there are a lot of abridgements. 1780s, 1790s, and the first decade of the new century, a lot of abridgements, especially of Moll Flanders. That's accounting for a lot of that uptick. Some of the editions are undated, so the dates are conjectural here, which might give kind of sharper bumps than you might normally expect. Was there anything in particular, Stephen? So I had to get the kind of chart up before I could respond to your question.
No, it was really just that the fact that courtship got a bump in roughly the same few years as the fiction. So I was just wondering about whether there's a particular coincidence of non-fiction and fictional publications or republications around those years.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of the actual 1790s, I think probably a lot of titles that are 1790 through 1820, when the publishers were operative, but the things themselves were undated, I probably assigned to 1790s. So that could account for some of that kind of those particularly sharp things. But the I'd say actually it's quite discrepant, because the religious courtship editions are all mostly 300, 350 pages, including the one that I had the title page of, published in, oh no, it's not that one. Published in Bungay. Who knows where Bungay is? Daniel Cook might know where Bungay is. Suffolk, I think. So you get the idea, but that's a 350-page book, whereas the Mole Flanders publications in the 1790s through to the 1820s are all abridgements, some of them as few as 8 pages. If this chart were to reflect pages printed, I'd conjecture that religious courtship would probably be something like 5 times as much as Mole Flanders, which is fascinating, isn't it? The same basically goes for A Journal of the Plague Year. You get a kind of, not very popular for a while, there's a mid 18th century edition, and then there's a bit of growth with abridged editions, which start in America really, but then start to happen a bit in Britain. Then it's in the 1810s that you start to get full-length editions or substantial abridgments, you know, just maybe 200 or 300 pages, just a bit lopped off and attributed to Defoe. And A Journal of the Plague Year is way more steady than anything else in the Victorian period, as you can see. It's quite a diagonal linear graph. This is really boring, isn't it? Whereas
No, it's not really boring. I was also really struck by that the fact that the Journal of the Plague Year line goes up quite steeply, just, and the Mole Flanders line, you know, as I suppose you might expect in the Victorian period, starts to flatline a little.
Yeah,
bit.
and the editions of Mole are by and large collections of Defoe's works. It was left out of the 1809-10 novels in which Walter Scott had a hand, as was Roxana, deemed too salacious. Thereafter, until 1896, Mole Flanders is not published in the Victorian period, in the 19th century, apart from collected works. A Journal of the Plague Year was very popular for the, you know, reasons you might imagine. The editions are really fascinating. Illustrations proliferate, some really good ones. Yeah, I've got all the material, but I focus today on the non-fiction. But yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff to be said about the fiction. That Crusoe line, by the way, I realised after I did this that I left out the translation, so that's only the English language editions.
Absolutely, thanks, Nick. That's brilliant. Question from Andrew McKendry. Andrew, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. The topic is very interesting. I guess, 2 questions, 2 related questions. The first one is.
Andrew, hang on a second. Let me just check. Nick, are you able to hear? Or perhaps Andrew, you could come
Is that
a little
better?
bit closer to your mic. Perfect.
Yeah, I had to move it closer. A couple questions, related questions, Nick. One is, was his work on nonconformity or dissent published much? Because it was still quite a relevant topic, but also so much of his writing on it is super topical, you know, about like debates over the occasional conformity act and stuff. So was there any interest in that, you know, later in the 18th century, as rational dissent was becoming politically important? And so that's the first question. And the second one was, you know, we make connections between his fiction and his non-fictional writing. Like we talk about how his political views inform, you know, Robinson Crusoe or whatever. But it's did they do that in later reprintings? Did they say, for instance, you know, in the original Power, Defoe envisioned sovereignty like this, and, you know, just like he does in Robinson Crusoe? Or did they not really make those kind of connections, say on like, you know, slavery and colonialism in Robinson Crusoe, you know, in relation to his non-fictional writings? So I guess those two questions: reprinted discussions of nonconformity, which might actually relate to his fiction. Did they talk about that, or did they make those connections?
Yeah, thank you. Very good questions. I think in immediate response to the first question, no. Pamphlets pertaining to nonconformity by and large are not reprinted. The place to go is Walter Wilson's 1830 memoirs, The Life and Times of Daniel Defoe. Wilson was a historian of nonconformist churches, and he published a 3-volume celebratory biography of Defoe in which he really championed Defoe the dissenter, Defoe the defender of nonconformist rights. And he printed in, those sort of 19th century biographers alike, he printed reams and reams of extracts from Defoe's pamphlets. Attribution-wise, they're mostly stable because most of his writings on, for example, the Occasional Conformity Act were printed in Defoe's lifetime collected works in 1705. So it was known about and it was written about in biographies, but they're not reprinted to any great extent. The question about connections between the non-fiction and the novels is really interesting. I think firstly you have to remember that by and large down to the 1780s, 90s, Defoe is only really thought about as the author of Robinson Crusoe. That's important to remember. A place that you might start thinking about these connections is a 1790 edition of Robinson Crusoe in 3 volumes, the first 2 of which are first part and the second of which is Father Adventures, and the third part is Chalmers's biography, Defoe's Appeal to Honour and Justice, that's its first reprinting since 1715, and The Original Power, which Chalmers had talked to the skies. So it's quite tacit, but there is that 1790 use of The Original Power in conjunction with Robinson Crusoe.
And I see the Appeal, it's like a biographical, and then to The Original Power, so Defoe's connected personally through it. Yeah, okay. Oh,
yeah, I mean, in terms of those readings of Robinson Crusoe as a kind of veiled autobiography of Defoe, that doesn't really come about until the 1860s. The places to go there are Charles Kingsley's edition of Robinson Crusoe, 1868, and William Lee's 1869 biography of Defoe, where they start to conjecture that they start to take the serious reflections at face value and think that it might be a autobiographical. But there are certainly discussions of Robinson Crusoe as a political novel and thinking about its political meaning. Yeah, thanks. Good
no, that's really interesting. That because I mean, I would, especially when you're discussing Scotland and independence, you would think there might be some politicized readings of his novels in relation to that. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, the other point to bear in mind about Defoe in Scotland is that until the very, very end of the 19th century, the letters weren't published. So the full extent of Defoe's actual role in
involvement
wasn't known about. When those letters were published in the Historical Manuscripts Commission, there was a kind of mixed response. On the one hand, people were saying, well, look how trusted he was. The top politicians of the day absolutely, believed everything this guy said to them. On the other hand, he started to look a bit less than honest.
Less honest than in the Appeal to Honour and Justice. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's good. Thanks, Dick.
Thanks. It's a great question and great response. Thank you both. David Brewer, would you like to unmute yourself?
Thanks, Nick, for that. It's always good to have some intellectual stimulation to offset the state of the world. I'm, I guess, interested in that less honest aspect that you just mentioned. I'm interested in how, say, the less flattering, less savory aspects of the biography accompany or don't accompany this work as it gets republished. Because my sense, and I'm by no means a Defoe person, that at least through the 1720s, the fact that he's been in the pillory is very hard to escape. The fact that he was in trade and a hosier and went bankrupt is hard to escape. There's a copy of the True-Born Englishman at the Senate House Library in London that says it was writ by Dan Defoe, a mercenary fellow that writ for and against all parties. And so that sort of political opportunism seems hard to escape in as far as Defoe's reputation goes in the first 3 decades of the century or so. Do those things still cling to him as he becomes the kind of writer you're talking about later, or is that all forgiven or forgotten?
It's all there. It's a very mixed picture in terms of reception. And so both those claims in his lifetime that he was writing pamphlets for and against his own pamphlets, and that he was a turncoat, carry on. As late as the 1790s, I'm trying to remember the details, but there's somebody else invokes Defoe in the House of Commons, and then there's a publication in a newspaper that says he's really not the sort of person that you should be invoking. He's pilloried and disreputable and all the rest of it. So it's absolutely all there. I would say that we've imbibed this idea that Defoe in his lifetime had this reputation, and it's undoubtedly there. But there's a flip side to that too. There were quite a few people in his lifetime, including enemies, who are writing quite positive things about his skills as a writer, or his political loyalty. But you're right, that stuff does cling to him, certainly through the rest of the 18th century. And I think it's with the Romantics that it starts to get flip-turned, because they start to read Robinson Crusoe in more aesthetic ways. There's a good essay, can't remember the name of the author. I can, if anybody's interested, there's a good essay on the romantic reading of Robinson Crusoe. And in turn, you start to get these assessments of Defoe as a kind of, always on our side, especially from a radical perspective. So I'm not downplaying that at all. But you don't see a lot of that in the editions, though. Of course, they're not going to bring out an edition of something and say the guy who wrote this was a rascal. Not a good selling point.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks. Next question is from Marta Kvander. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. So Nick, thank you for the talk. It was fascinating, very interesting. I really appreciated all the information, all the data that you've provided. And it raised for me questions about understandings of authorship and attribution and what it means to attribute a work to an author. And so I have kind of a two-pronged question, I guess. One is whether Defoe's own work, the essay on the regulation of the press, I think it is called, got republished, whether that contributed to the debates. Okay, that was a quick one then. But then curious to hear how you are thinking about the work you're doing about Defoe being republished, in how that sort of situates in that context of the especially late 18th century discussion of debate over and reframing of what it means to be an author. And I'm thinking of this in part because Defoe's own thinking is very much about, it's about legal attribution. You've got to have somebody to pin the thing on. And it seems like there's lots of ways in which that resonates with some of the connections, attribution or non-attribution of his, especially political texts. So I'm really just curious to hear your thoughts about this particular topic in relationship to this larger sense of authorship.
Yes, thank you. No, it's not quite. I mean, the essay on the regulation of the press wasn't attributed to Defoe until the end of the 18th century. That's something about that. But I think I'm right in saying that it wasn't reprinted even in the Summers Tract in the mid-century. So that's straightforward. In terms of attribution and the political writings, it's such a bumpy road, really. A lot of it is casual and innocuous, and therefore you don't know how trustworthy it is, at least the sort of down to the 1780s when George Chalmers draws up the first bibliography. That sort of enshrines a certain number of things. Then going into the 19th century, Wilson starts to attribute willy-nilly, with a great degree of accuracy, really. Then I suppose there's the example of William Lee, who brings out the 1869 biography, which includes two volumes of Defoe's uncollected journalism, essentially. You've got to remember, this is a time when the review is so obscure. you see occasional passing mentions to do you know this newspaper was written by this man, Daniel Defoe? Nobody's reading it. The most illustrative example of Defoe's writings, a work that in his lifetime was so closely associated with him and which he claimed, is just not on the radar at all. So it's quite a skewed understanding of him as an author. But when the letters that revealed Defoe's role as a kind of double agent for the Whigs post the Tories' fall in 1714-15 come out, Lee tries to sort of take the spotlight off of any kind of political duplicity by republishing all of this early Hanoverian journalism, which is mostly on kind of moral or issues like crime and social kind of issues rather than party politics, as a way of deflecting, really. And so to some degree, you're seeing there the kind of mid-Victorian discomfort with writers who are so politically engaged. And that's a part of Defoe's legacy. Up until the Romantics, there's discomfort with the fact that he was so politically engaged, where individual works like The Original Power are reprinted, it's as a work of political philosophy rather than as a narrow topical intervention. It's not a narrowly Whiggish piece, it's a kind of Lockean sort of account of political sovereignty. So yeah, that's a series of ramblings rather than any kind of answer to your question. Sorry, 5 o'clock on a Friday, 5 o'clock on a Wednesday here.
Not at all. I was going to say, are you okay for one last question, Nick, or do you need to
keep it coming? Yes,
that's brilliant. Okay, lovely. So last question then from Elizabeth Porter. If you could unmute, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was really useful and so interesting. I was interested in the portion where you were talking about how Samuel Richardson had edited and worked on the tour through Great Britain. I remember reading just recently in Pat Rogers' work about that a little bit, and I just didn't know if we could go back and pause on that just to think about what that means of Richardson editing and working on Defoe. I think it's an interesting conversation that hasn't come up so much in novel studies, that this author was, the Richardson then who became, there's always like a debate of who's the father of the novel. What this might do for our conversation in novel studies, or whether to take it out of novel studies and just think about these two people, in the print culture working on various texts that might not have anything to do with the novel, might be but just thinking about that kind of intertextual relationship that I don't think gets pointed out so much.
Yeah, this is going by memory a bit. I think in Defoe's life, if I get it right, Richardson does print something of Defoe's. Is it The Complete English Tradesman? One of the editions of that?
It's the great, you mentioned in the Great Tour, the tour through Great Britain.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
It's the 2nd through 5th edition, which is really interesting that he did that many editions of Defoe's work.
Yeah, I was just thinking as well that he also did actually print other Defoe works, but you're right. So in terms of Richardson and that sort of series of editions through to his death of tour, my inclination, but I'm open to discussion about it, is to think of it in the second way that you mentioned, in terms of print culture activity, rather than telling us a great deal about the intertextual or genre development kind of approaches to the novel. And that's because by and large, I've not done the work yet, although it's work that I'm kind of inclined to do, is to look at where Richardson was getting it all from, because he wasn't writing it. He was plagiarizing, as he did all the time. The only work I've done on Richardson as a printer involved a so-called third volume of Gulliver's Travels that he brought out. The irony of a writer who objected so much to spurious sequels to his own work was happy to, earlier on in his career, bring out a spurious sequel to Swift's, and it's ripped off, plagiarized. So I've not looked into the details, but I think that most of the sections from the tour that appear in the Richardson editions are derivative. I don't know if that changes the kind of the question, but it shows that he's obviously reading Defoe and working with it.
Great, thank you very much. Thought from John McTague. a nice, yeah, that's a really nice thought on reputation. That Nick's closing remark about people finding Defoe very adaptable was a nice way into thinking about the flip side of untrustworthy accusations. That Defoe was not only someone who adapts too readily, but someone who you can also readily adapt. Tells us a lot about early 18th century culture. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Nick, for a wonderful Q&A, for your generous responses to questions. Shall we close by giving a final virtual round of applause? I'm afraid you'll be the only person, I'll be the only person you can hear, but you can see everybody else applauding there. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for everyone for coming and for being a part of it. Really appreciate it.
So I'm going